the doors and can someone grab that one? Or actually, leave that one. Sorry, leave that one open. That's okay. Leave that one. We'll let people.
You're doing questions at the very end.
Very end. Yes, questions at the very end.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, let's get.
Welcome everybody. I'm so glad we have such a good group here today. This is. I'm trying to avoid this. This is dancing during this. This is Aiden Hirshfield's final oral review of his dissertation, and it is being live streamed like 2 different ways right now.
Three.
So
3 different ways.
3 different ways. Don't get nervous. It's gonna be good. Aiden has done a magnificent job with this research. I know that it's going to get published, and it's very exciting stuff, new territory, and it's also gonna. It has a big social justice element, so I think it's going to do good in the world as well. So, as you see, it's using Instagram and selfies to explore body image in gender diverse individuals.
Thank you. Hello. Hello. Yes, there we go. Thank you. No, it's no problem. Thank you, guys. So I'm excited to bring this here to Fielding. I actually presented my research before it was done at the International Gender and Sexuality Conference in Oklahoma City. And I actually think that was a more terrifying audience because it was an audience of my peers who were about to ask me the hard questions. Because you've got like baseline knowledge of gender diversity when you hear it. And then you've got like, people who are and really want to know the in-depth stuff. So I learned a lot from that experience, and that kind of shaped this presentation and the rest of my research. So I'm excited to share. So we'll just move on.
So Aiden's going to present. I'm sorry, I forgot to say something. And let's see, Dan, you are
Oh, yeah.
methodologist, yes?
I have a slide for this.
Yes.
Look.
I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. I don't see Jerry Lynn, are you here?
Some of them, yeah, and some of them are joining online too. I know that Brad will probably join us online.
Sorry, I just.
No, that's right. Yes, so my esteemed committee and their beautiful faces. Here I have so much different perspectives when you go to do a dissertation, and even though it's frustrating to navigate that, in terms of one paper and like all these comments, but it shapes it. It really does make a huge difference, and I'm so appreciative for each of them giving me definitely like strong feedback every time and shaping this paper and this presentation. So, all right. So just like any dissertation, we'll get into the nitty-gritty stuff. We're going to talk about one thing that I didn't talk about on here is I'm going to share some personal information too. So I feel this is a comfortable, safe space for me. I see a lot of friendly faces, and that makes me feel good and confident about this. So this will be kind of a general outline, and we'll just move right in. Why wait? Okay. So the goal of my research was to explore the use of Instagram selfies posted by gender variant individuals. And that's those who identify other than cisgender. And I know that is, for some people, we need a definition for that. So cisgender is anyone who their gender identity, typically, obviously, male or female, aligns with that is assigned at birth. Okay, so pretty much most of the people in this room probably have never considered themselves gender diverse, right? Or within another identity other than male or female. So this is a huge umbrella. And the reason I left it open to gender variant is because I'm really trying to get people to understand that this umbrella is so vast and so wide and so unique and so diverse that we can't quantify it. We have to just explore it and lay the territory. So that was really the purpose of this study, was to find some, ground foundational work. And so this is in relation specifically to body image, gender identity, and expression. Okay, so one of the things that shaped this project for me, people can come in and out. Yeah, everyone's coming. Okay. So one thing that shaped this project for me was my master's thesis. So I looked at how representation affected the identity or the sense of identity and sense of self of trans people specifically. And that led me to a few different things, specifically my uses and gratification theory, which came from Bradley Bond, my external reader. I was so fortunate to have a person of inspiration that I founded my paper on and my research, and many, many classes before had already written about him. And had criticized him definitely a few times, got to be a part of this. And so this was a foundational study, uses and gratification. It laid the field for what are trans people doing online, how are they using the media, and how is it helping them in any way. And so that led me to Instagram and another study too. So In 2015, the truly first national survey on transgender census data, basically. And that came out, and it said something very important among a lot of other important things. If anyone's interested, please go find that online. It's public data. But this was what stuck out to me, and it helped me form this idea. And the idea is that more than 1/3 of their respondents indicated that their gender identity was best described as non-binary or genderqueer. So that tells me that 1 out of 3 trans people identify as more than one thing at a time, or possibly over their lifetime, right? So there's this complexity of identity that's happening within this umbrella. So to start, gender is a social construct. So we have to really digest what this is first before we can explore it. So it's a social construct that differs among culture, generations, and geography. And the polarization of gender variant groups, such as the transgender community, into these masculine or feminine labels forces them to adapt to binary expectations, right? Rather than celebrating their unique forms of identity. So I have a couple of things to say about this. So the diverse representations that exist in the world, I believe, is restricted by these normative conceptions and expectations that people have of each other, right? So for instance, in normal day-to-day life, maybe a trans person has to dress more masculinely or more feminine than they prefer to, right? They might be more ambiguous. They might define themselves differently. But these normative conceptions about expression in terms of masculine and femininity forces them to do and act ways that they maybe wouldn't or don't feel comfortable doing. So an example in my life is, you're a man now, so you have to blank and add XYZ here. Open the door, carry the groceries, propose to your partner. And these are all things that when I transitioned, people told me, it's the expectations that they had of me had changed because of their perception of what gender is and what it means to me. So one of the things that I would say is people insert themselves in gender identity and development a lot of times, and when people go to transition, they say things like that, and they are doing it in a joking manner a lot of times, and just to kind of maybe validate that person. But honestly, I think that forces almost more onto people than really they need. What they need is a space like Instagram to explore and to express themselves in maybe a safer space than they can in person, maybe a more comfortable space. So this is what I'm seeing in my life, right? And I'm going on Instagram as a trans person, looking at other people, identifying that way, sharing my story, sharing my body. And that is what led me really here. I have this in here. Don't assume anything and ever. This is my PSA to everyone. Please don't assume anyone's anything. And I can tell you all about that. All right, so to synthesize this a little bit, this is a funny anecdote. I have, so I gotta tell a story. My master's thesis, my dad asked a really good question. That's not my dad's here. But that's Ron Swanson, but he's great, and this is perfect. But he asked me something at the end of my master's thesis that really helped me keep coming back to this question, and keep tackling it and not letting it just settle on one thing, right? It's, do you identify as a man or do you identify as transgender? And this was a hard question to answer because it truly, really depends on the context. Because gender variant people have to consider a number of factors when they disclose their identity, because many places in the world, it's a matter of life and death, okay? So the short answer, right, I'm privileged enough to openly identify as trans in most contexts. But if I ever have to identify as a man, it's likely wouldn't be because I typically identify as a man because it's not true to my experience, right? I'm gonna do it out of necessity. I'm gonna do it out of fear for my safety or concern for any of my rights that aren't protected, especially in the United States too. And so these are a number of things that we have to consider when we look at this community. Because if we don't consider these things, how can we truly understand what's happening, right? We can't understand the interchangeability of this. And so one of the criticisms, I'm telling you, I'm criticizing my external, right? Prior to him being my external. And one of the things that I criticized him for was that he wasn't part of the community, and nor was anyone on his team. And so to me, that said, well, how can you truly ask the right questions? how can you really get close to your subject matter if you're not like listening to the input of the community, right? If you're just, but they laid foundational work, and now I, of course, don't criticize them for that anymore because I know how hard it is to do a research study. But in the same idea, in the same vein, this is why I did this project. This is why this needed to be done. So I'm getting off my soapbox, guys. Okay, we're coming back. All right. So we kind of have to understand, right, body image and the intersection of this complexity, okay? Because body image is specifically unique for the gender variant community because of all the reasons I'm telling you, and for more, right? So it's a great quote. As a biological entity, the body has a functional role, but as a social entity, it is the most visible way of expressing and presenting someone's identity. The attitude towards the body and the bodily practices, including appearance management behaviors, reflect the value constellation of a particular society, right? So the idea here is that we can't really say anything until we know. The idea is that body and gender identity, these are all social constructs. The way we see ourselves, the way we perceive others, it's all part of this contextual experience. And so my contextual experience is just Instagram, right? I'm just generalizing only for this very small portion. So we'll get into my literature review. So Kosenko, Bond, and Hurley, as I said, they did their uses and gratifications. So they found that trans people use media to make sense of feelings, sexual relations, community, and transition options, to create a shared meaning of transgender identity experience, and to facilitate difficult conversations that could otherwise be considered dangerous in face-to-face situations. They also used it to construct and facilitate community development, including the formation of common language and definitions. And that was particularly important to my study because I wanted to know what language. What do you mean by that? What kind of common language are these people sharing, and how are they doing it? Another important part, right? Because we're talking about the intersection of selfies specifically with body image in the context of gender diversity. And so Tienenberg and Gomez, they wrote a fantastic paper on selfies and negotiating body image in terms of selfies. And they said, the taking and sharing of selfies is a negotiated and complex activity that spotlights the tension between the act of self-shooting, normative assumptions about gender and body image, and the ecology of images themselves. And it elucidates control issues, power, agency, and the power of looking and being seen. And this, I can't tell you, I wanted to put this on an entire page in my paper. This is everything that I couldn't say and more about what I knew to exist specifically for the gender diverse community in terms of selfies. Because here I am, a gender diverse person posting selfies online, thinking about this, watching my friends doing it, experiencing this thing with them as a community in a safer environment than I could anywhere else at the time. So I promise last of my long block quotes, guys. All right, better body image and context. So this is specifically, they're looking at trans population and female populations, and they're looking at what body image does what selfies does for body image in terms of it. So better body image exists in context where they're not required to conform to a binary ideal of gender expression. And this was also for women too. This wasn't just true for the people of gender diversity, right? This was also true for other people. So that says another thing to me, right? I'm thinking, I'm calculating, I'm connecting all the dots. Because there's nothing really for the gender diverse community in terms of Instagram and selfies. No one's done this. So I'm trying to connect these dots. And this tells me specifically that cisgender people are challenged by these normative conceptions of identity. So even cis people are forcing themselves into boxes, smaller and smaller boxes, in terms of what these conceptions and expectations are around them. And this, I feel, is perpetuated in the conversations that I have with people, regardless of gender diversity or cisgender identity. Everyone's saying the same thing, that they're affected by these. So another foundational work in this area, like I said, was the US Transgender Survey, which is incredible. But what I pulled from that, that was more than 1/3 of respondents indicated that their gender identity was more than one thing. But they also collected open-ended responses. They wanted to know what other identities, but they didn't even put it in the results section because they had over 500 unique identities input into their survey, okay? And this is just, for me, says everything. I'm like, oh, I'm on it. I know I'm on the right page now. I'm going for it. So what I pulled from that, I was like, how can I even search? How can I look for images of selfies by gender diverse individuals? I have to start somewhere. I can't start with 500 unique identities, and I can't just have one, right? And this is something I went back and forth with. So I ended on the top 4 identities that the trans survey pulled, and that was non-binary, genderqueer, trans, and transgender. All unique things, all unique identities. I had 2 research questions that ended up kind of being the first part of my study and the second part of my study. Okay, 2. All right. First question was, what themes emerge from public Instagram selfies posted by gender variant individuals regarding gender identity, expression, and body image? So I'm just trying to explore, just want to know what comes in. And then second thing I wanted to do was I wanted to know the differences in the themes and narratives between these hashtags. So what were people saying? Were they saying the same things? Were they saying different things? I had exciting news and answers. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about my procedure. So again, the aim of this research was to explore gender variant experience with body image through the lens of Instagram selfies. So I pulled hashtags. So for me, hashtags were self-identified cataloging. And I argued that if a user chose to claim an identity like hashtag non-binary, they were holding that space, right? To me, that was they're participating in that identity, so I can include them in that space, right? So hashtags served actually a couple of purposes in my study. They were to search and collect the post from using Instagram, but they were also coded for frequency of occurrence. So that was within my content analysis, and I'll show you an example. I would include the hashtags too. So if I'm reading and someone says hashtag makeup day, I would include that as something with thematic context. So we'll get into that. I collected 125 posts from each hashtag, so a total of 500. We used the first 25 posts from each to do a pilot study and develop a codebook. And I have on here and online 2 researchers that helped me make this happen. And it was a process to try to figure out even how to get here. So we also collected captions. So that was the big thing. That's where the content analysis came from, are the captions themselves. And that is the text that accompanies an Instagram post. If you've never been on Instagram before, like this is what it actually looks like. And so you can click into that and it'll show a user has given a caption. I didn't include comments because I didn't want to know what other people were saying. I only wanted to know what that user specifically said. I didn't include images. I took away the images from the content because I'm not going to subject my perspective and my judgment on someone else's image, which I've seen done over and over and over again in research in this way, which I think is not appropriate. And so we use that pilot stuff to make the codebook and to refine that codebook. And the code's right here. So the preliminary codebook that came out of the pilot study was a little bit long, but it had 3 main overarching thematic elements that also really spoke from the literature, in my opinion. And so we went back and forth thinking, how can I respect the literature and knowing what I'm looking for, but also respect what I already see in terms of what the data already says. And so we found body satisfaction, body dissatisfaction, and body augmentation. And so these 2 are obvious. They're kind of the opposites of each other. But the body augmentation was specifically unique. This was really body augmentation and modification. And so that's clothes or accessories, hair, facial hair, makeup, hormones, surgery, tattoos and piercings, even if they used an image filter. This is any way that they could augment or change or modify what's being perceived. Okay, so a coding example. This is perfect. So this is an actual post that I pulled, and this is what it looked like in the software that I use, which is Deduce. So for this person, they were part of the transgender data set, and the caption is what reads after the 1, 2, 3. So this says non-edited photos, just natural light. Everyone has flaws. We may see them and give ourselves a hard time, but it's those flaws others learn to love about us. Stay strong, everyone. And then it's a bunch of hashtags, which were also included, like I said, in the content analysis. And so this excerpt was coded for themes under the body augmentation, which became body modification, body perception, specifically satisfaction, and then additional hashtags. And we'll talk about the additional hashtags in a second. Talk a little bit about my results. Okay, so the first thing that I found was that body modification was most present in the overarching thematic categories. So most people that posted talked, regardless of what group they were from, talked about body modification, specifically clothing and hair and accessories, appearing most frequently for that. Oh yeah, let me tell you, for the first body modification, some of the other things that appeared, which I expected, were hormone replacement therapy was one that appeared in body modification pretty often, tattoos and piercings, which was an expectation, and makeup. And this is most present, the HRT was most present in the trans and transgender data set, which tells me there is a difference. We're seeing a difference between how body modification is approached in both the trans community and maybe the non-binary or more androgynous part of the community. Oh, we'll go back. Okay. So another thing I found was the child code that appeared the most was self-acceptance, and that fell under body satisfaction, appearing most in the body perception category. And so
Aiden, could you tell them what parent and child codes are?
yes, okay, that's a good question. I was gonna say, if anyone had questions, I'm like, feel weird. I'm just talking and no one's asking questions. Normally it's like conversion, like conversation. Okay, so these, when you go to code, I'll go back, actually, that's a really good question. Perfect, okay. So this body satisfaction, body dissatisfaction, and body augmentation, those are parent codes. And then anything below that would be a child code. And then below that would be a grandchild code. And so what happens is when you go to code it, they fall under the levels above them as well. So you get data for those specific codes, but you also, it aggregates it for you in the full parent code. Perfect. Okay, so yes, conversely, for this one, so body dissatisfaction codes appeared the least. So that was to social acceptance and physical attributes. And when combined we looked at comparison photos, because that is something that I see very often. And I wanted to know if other communities were doing comparison photos specifically, because in my mind, I'm thinking people who consider themselves trans or transgender are probably more likely to post HRT or hormone replacement comparison photos, right? But are non-binary genderqueer people posting comparison photos? And that's something I found that they do, that it is apparent across the board. So body perception as an overarching category theme was in 84%. So body perception, I knew, was connected to satisfaction, was connected to self-acceptance. And these, to me, were honestly surprising results in terms of when I was thinking about, because we have this perception, I think, generally when we go on social media, I don't know about everyone else, but things can be kind of negative, right? You're reading things, you're hearing people's heartfelt, emotional, powerful stories about what's going on with them. And for me specifically, it touched somewhere so deep and powerful. And there was a lot of captions that I went through that were hard to read. Some that I had to go back to later and feel again. Because what stood out to me though, was that these people truly are posting these selfies to potentially feel that, again, that form of validation, affirmation, self-acceptance, body satisfaction. So something's going on here. And I know that, but I can't, say any more about it other than what I found. So 84% of the posts collected contained hashtags with a gender identity or expression language other than the 4 that I used. So for example, this is perfect. Go back. Okay. So for example, this person used another gender identity and expression because they used hashtag trans boy down there. So that's a unique form of identity and expression. So that was coded as an additional gender identity. And I didn't do the unique ones, but this replicates exactly what they found, if not further proves that there's so much more happening and so much more complexity to identifying as a gender diverse person or gender variant person than we know to exist, right? We're putting labels on things that actually don't exist, right? Because they're so exceptionally broad. And now comparatively, for sexual orientation, that appeared in 68%. So people were talking about these things simultaneously, which is something for my future research that I'm going to explore, is the intersection of sexual orientation and gender identity in the way that we express and talk about ourselves. And out of the 4 hashtags collected, transgender and trans were the ones appearing most, and they co-appeared most frequently with all the other ones. So again, replicating this idea that trans people specifically identify as more than one thing or have. An example of some of my results, just so you guys can kind of understand what it looks like. So you can see the different data sets on the side and the codes that went into them. And when you get up here, this is where you really have the most happening, and which is exactly what I was saying. The gender identity hashtags and the additional expression language that people are using was most frequent. So you really see this exploding over here. The other thing exploding here is self-acceptance. And so this is where I'm starting to see these unique patterns happening as well. Okay, getting into my discussion. Okay, so Instagram posts analyzed in this research showed a tendency for individuals to express the feeling of self-acceptance, especially in relation to body modification tools, behaviors, and social acceptance. So the results here posit that body modification may be a better predictor of self-acceptance and sense of unity between gender identity and body image. So this is an important finding because it suggests that not all gender variant individuals experience dysphoria or desire to align with a particular gender identity. Future research, I say, future research must not assume that the gender experience life transitioning places individuals at odds with their physical characteristics, but rather potentially facilitates more self-acceptance in gender ambiguity. Hopefully that makes sense. Nervous, guys. Okay. So I talked about future research, right? Okay. I wanted to say that future research, so I'm going to publish this, but I'm going to do a phase 2 where I actually do the really qualitative data that I wanted to find, which is like interview data. But in terms of time management, finish your dissertation. Get it done. Yeah. All right, so we'll talk about the limitations. Like I said, Bradley Bond and I have a funny relationship where we go back and forth. He's like, well, you have to include this limitation. You have to include this. And so I have a lot of limitations here. Not that I feel my study is terrible. Okay, so to keep this study both timely and feasible, I could only include those 4 identities. Of course, I wish I could have gone and searched every hashtag and pulled 125 posts for each, but this was already a lot. Another thing was that these are public posts, right? So plenty of people on Instagram have private pages. I didn't get to know what they're talking about. And so that could absolutely skew the results that I have. Also, during the time that I was pulling data was the National Coming Out Day. So that's something that also probably potentially affected my results. We only pulled posts that were written in English. Yes.
The date you chose, was that strategic? Did you?
No, I didn't actually. That's a good question. Yeah, it just happened to be that when I pulled all the data first, and we filtered for selfies as we went through, right? So I'm pulling data, but I'm not reading the captions necessarily. So I didn't until I went to read through them. I was like, oh, well, National Coming Out Day, great. So glad I didn't look at this. And of course, me, I didn't even post. So we also only pulled posts written in English. This was because neither of us spoke another language, and so we couldn't be certain to what that person was intending to say. And so future research, I would like to include more. We also had to disregard emojis. And surprisingly, this was like a big hot topic of debate between us because emojis really are, in my opinion, I think a lot of people who use emojis, right, we use them to express something in a powerful emotion usually, right? And so I would have loved to include emojis, but emojis don't appear the same on every device. They don't appear the same for each person, right? Everyone perceives them to be differently. And the only standard to which I had to work from was the Unicode standard, which basically quantifies them as smiling or not. So it's like, there's really no like in between for that. And there's not a lot of research on emojis yet. So that would be a fun topic of debate as well, or a fun topic of interest. That's it. Thank you. Now for questions.
Okay, so we're gonna, I'm gonna open it up to the committee. I see Jerry Lynn's here now, and Dan, why don't you two go first, then I'll go, and then we'll open it up to everyone.
Do I probably have to hold this closer. Speak loudly.
Oh, speak loud. Aiden, great work. And I was struck by your statement about the private posts. And have you thought about how you might be able to do research on the private posts? Because if they're widely used, then that's a large potential population.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's what I want to do in phase 2 is open it up to interviews. So I would reach out to people at that point or survey people and then go from there in terms of like, okay, are people with private Instagram accounts willing to let me access that and then go through their data?
So if you were able to access or get them to at least talk to you, then you would see if you could get access to their private posts.
Exactly, yeah. And I've seen similar things done in research on Facebook because the same thing is occurring. And so I'd like to maybe follow or learn some more about that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
I think I have to move to get closer to the mic.
Yeah. We have YouTube like on the mic only.
Okay, so the first question I have for you is you said you had 125 for each one of the categories, right? Were you able to make sure that they were unique individuals? So in other words, was it the duplication?
Oh yeah, so I didn't talk about that. There's a lot of different procedure rules that we had to come up with that I didn't feel I could talk about all at once here. And so one of those was what we had to keep a list of what users we were pulling posts from in each category. So I didn't duplicate the posts, or I didn't want more than one post from the same user. So as we went through, we had an Excel spreadsheet of just the posts and where to get them and things like that. And then I deleted all that private content, anything identifying for those users. Yeah.
Oh, I got several.
Okay, so the next one is the time frame. Was it just that single day that you were pulling from? Okay, and so where did the National Coming Out Day come in?
On one of those days. I'm not certain.
Okay, all right. So then the next one, the body satisfaction that appeared the most in the body perception, and you said a little bit about that, but I'm really curious as far as, what does previous literature have to say with that about that? How you might compare that with other populations, for example? Do you think there was something innate in the fact that they decided to post? Was there that savoring piece? That's why I'm posting, because I have positive body image and perception.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is something that it's interesting. Brad and I talked about that a lot. We went back and forth with, how can I tell, why someone posted what they did, and how can you tell the difference between someone who potentially had higher self-efficacy and higher body satisfaction who would post versus maybe I didn't catalog people who had lower body satisfaction, who didn't post as much. So that's kind of the thing. So the previous literature on selfies kind of is complex in that issue in terms of validation theories and affirmation in terms of like, I post because I want people to like my stuff, right? And that makes me have higher self-efficacy and social acceptance and all these different categories, right? And body satisfaction. But other literature has shown that people that post actually have lower body satisfaction because of XYZ. And so it's very complex. And so I didn't feel that I could say much on that subject because I really was just talking about what was said in these particular posts, and for I couldn't quantify the reason.
Okay, so that's a perfect segue to my next one. What do you think you might have left out by making sure that they had text? How about all those people that posted pictures only?
Oh, like only posted a selfie?
Right.
Yeah, I think that's great for my second research study, which I'll be interviewing people, and that'll be talking more about why maybe people chose to post with no content or no caption at all, because I think that's super interesting. Tons of times we had to disregard posts because they only included emojis. And so I really want to know, it's such a rich subject area, but it's just something I couldn't do this time. And so I would like to approach that next time. Oh yeah, Dan. Next.
Okay, this is my last and final. Were you too close to it?
So actually, it's funny. So we did. Jerry-Lynn and I had this conversation, and God, Karen and I had this conversation a million times. When every week I'm emailing her, just desperate, like I'm too close to this. Like it just hurts. I can't look at my data. And that's so true. Absolutely. I think I don't recommend anyone after this to do something so close to them and to their subject, especially because I was just really navigating my transition as I started doing a lot of these research studies. And so, of course, for me, it's even more complex, and I'm learning things about myself in the process. And that absolutely is something that if you're too close to it, it's potentially as a possible to skew the data or change the way you look at it, which was the reason that I had a second researcher, is really so we could have that reliability for that data.
Okay. First of all, amazing job. And so I have two questions. First one is, I think this is a great opportunity for me and others to educate ourselves about gender diversity, because if you're in a privileged group, you may not know very much about gender diversity. So help me out with this one. So the transgender and the 4 hashtags groups people, you called it body modification, clothes, hair, like we change our hair, we color our hair, we put on different clothing. So a person could not have had any surgery, not have any hormones or anything like that, still have the body they were born with, but they could be gender diverse and modify themselves according to your definitions here by changing clothes and hair and things like that. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Obviously, Karen has worked with me very closely on this. So that's exactly what it is. Yeah. And that's what that I knew was happening in the literature that I just wanted to show. And that's exactly what I found, in which I think the national survey showed, is that there is so much more complexity to identifying as trans. This idea that you have to transition to identify as trans isn't real. People can identify very widely and broadly among this spectrum and have a very different perception of, in terms of your perception of them, of their expression. And so this would be an example of maybe a gender queer person who one day they dress very masculinely and the next they dress very feminine, right? So that's a great question. So that modification is important.
That made me think about my own gender expression. Like I put on a dress today and high heels and stuff like that. And sometimes I've worn, like a baseball cap and a t-shirt or something. And I feel kind of weird with that. Like, am I a boy? I don't know what's going on here. So like, am I a real boy? Sorry, oversharing, #oversharing. But anyway, okay. So aside from my own gender identity, let's go back to, I'll talk about that. Let's go. I have a big question, and it was prompted in part by Jerry-Lynn's. So I do research on diversity, gender, race, sexual orientation, other things. And sometimes I struggle with myself because I'm white, I'm one set of things. And so is it okay for me to talk about other races, other genders, other experiences? I don't want to talk for a group of people that I don't belong to. But then again, there's another side that argues each one of us needs to care about everyone's struggle. So it doesn't matter that I'm white. I want people to care about women's issues if they're not a woman, So I was thinking about all that, and then I was thinking about you saying maybe I was too close to this, but then Brad's study, he should have had some trans people in there. So do you have any conclusions about is it okay for people outside the group to study a different group? Is it not okay for you to study the group you're in? How do we make sense of who should study what, or maybe how we talk about a group that we're in or not in?
Yeah. So it's actually funny you asked me that. Literally, my partner and I were just talking in the car before I came here about why I was still feeling so insecure about my research. And it's all, I think for my self journey through this process, it's been the feeling of imposter syndrome, even imposter syndrome in my own space, really, because I know that I'm privileged in as a trans person in many, many ways. And so it is very tough, I think, to ask yourself these hard questions when you go through this process, but it definitely shaped my outcome. And that is, Brad and I had this conversation right at the end, was, you know what, this is important. This is so important. This holds space. This gives voice. This does all the things that you need it to do. And it didn't overstep. And I think that's where it comes down to, in my own very little understanding of how this, where I'm still shaping what I'm thinking about it. And I think it really does come down to intent and flexibility too. And also especially really who you're giving, how you're giving voice. What are you doing exactly? Yeah.
That's a good point, that you gave voice to these people too who are in your study.
Yeah.
So let's open it up to anyone.
There
who
are
wants to-
Zoom questions also.
Oh my gosh, there's questions.
Here for a while.
I'm here. Yeah. What time is it? We got till 6. Okay. Okay. I'm going to leave this here. If you guys could just speak up, maybe. Yes, Regina.
Aiden, great study. I think on the issue of are you too close, there are pluses and minuses. And I think you need to put it, I think you've done that on a continuum. And the literature in anthropology has really discussed this. The outsider going in to study a culture, or do you try to become an insider? And so there are pluses and minuses. I'm curious, in gathering your data, did you do a little reading on sort of the algorithm that Instagram uses? Because clearly what we see is mediated by an algorithm. Facebook is different, right? And so I'm just curious there are a lot of studies on Twitter that talk about that in terms of research.
Yeah.
What it does show, what it doesn't. Same with Facebook. Did you find any literature that could tell us a little bit about, are you seeing, because it's sorting what you see for you. And I'm curious, would that be considered a limitation?
Absolutely. So the thing with Instagram, and this, I can't tell you, through my QE, through my concept paper, through everything, I was pulling my hair out, trying to find any information about Instagram's algorithm. And I'm a tech guy. So I know what they're talking about when they're talking about this stuff. And so it really is very mysterious, and it's on purpose, and it changes all the time. And so unfortunately, there's really nothing I could do about that. And it definitely affected, it would affect anyone that goes on the site just as much as it would affect how I pull stuff from the site. So one thing I did do to help with that, though, is that when you are on Instagram, your feed is built out of whoever you follow. So I went on as a user that didn't follow anyone. So I created a research bot, and it had no sense of, and I put it on a different VPN, a different IP. It's I did all the things I could to really randomize the data that I got. Yeah, but there's nothing. It's unfortunate. The
Did you
research.
include that in your study?
Yeah, it's in my
Okay.
dissertation. Yeah. Dorothy.
So I'm gonna follow my sister from another mister. I'm very much intrigued by this public-private thing. And I don't know if there's any research that talks about what people tend to go private on Twitter versus being public. And how do you think that may have affected the results that you got?
Absolutely. So I think I didn't see any research, and I dug, and I mean dug for Instagram specifically, but I did find enough in some other areas. And one of the things that was salient in that was that people on their private spaces tend to post things more vulnerable. And so that absolutely can affect what I'm finding in terms of generalizing for the population, which is why I think it was a process of me going forward, stepping back in terms of what I could truly say about the population, which I didn't feel I could. I feel I can only say what I can say about this particular group of people, I pulled captions from it, and then that's as far as
Do
I
you
can
think
go.
what attributes like education, income, profession, those affect? whether it's private
I
or
don't
public?
necessarily know
Okay.
that is a factor in it, but I'm curious. Yeah. Yeah.
So congratulations.
Thank you.
I was curious along Dorothy's line does Instagram, do you know demographics? Do you know race? Do you know gender? Do you know, and does that pre-select itself too?
No, actually, that is one of the reasons I picked Instagram is that anonymity to it, and that there's not that data that affects really everything else. And so it is a space that you cultivate yourself. So Instagram really is truly unique in that way, and that it's based solely on images, so people can really change, versus Facebook that makes you kind of verify as you go. Yeah, and so I think it has, there's a different way that people are using Instagram, but it hasn't been studied.
From my point of view, I would say if you've got compassion for our people, our community, then that's a plus. And if you're really close to it in the first place, like we know some of our people that want to study SR, then that would be good. But on the case of the genderqueer, did you always make sure that there was trans in there, or could genderqueer stand alone?
Yeah. So that was one of the occurring themes that I pulled from was how often are people using these interchangeably, but specifically that was one thing that was hard to do was, am I pulling people that are just using this one hashtag? But that's honestly what I found is that people are using them so interchangeably that it was more difficult to say this person specifically identifies as genderqueer because I'm only going based off of what they included in their post and the hashtag that they used.
Yeah, when you did the private versus public, did you use a non-signed in account?
That's what I said. Yeah, I created a research bot account and then I put it on it's like a series of events. Yeah. But please read my dissertation if you're so inclined. Monique, yes, thank you.
Wonderful dissertation,
Thank you.
Aiden. I guess when I hear this question about, close or distance, particularly when it comes to qualitative research, it makes me think more about what sensibilities that you bring to your study. About things that you thought about that you had to be sensitive to, and where you were situated in those sensitivities, as whether it was about you or others. Because I think that this notion of we can debate back and forth, but there are pluses and minuses to that. But I guess for me as a qualitative research, I think about my sensibilities and how I manage those sensibilities within my study methodologically as well as ethically.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. I think I'm still discovering this as I go. And I think what I truly meant was I don't recommend anyone being this close to this research if they're doing their dissertation, just because the dissertation is such an emotional process and a journey on its own. But yeah, this is such a hot topic of debate is like, in-group, out-group, who should be doing this research. But yeah, I think you're so right. That's going to stick with me.
I mean, I would encourage you to think about it, even as you get ready to go into your next studies, to take some time and look at, go in some of the qualitative research and read up on what sensibilities really and how you really can play with that. Mm-hmm. Because I think it will be important for you relative to the choices that you're making, given how personal this research is to you. And I would always encourage students to think about what you want to do. You go for it, whether you're close to it or far from it. You just have to basically make sure that you have thought through the ethical considerations, call it out in your limitations if you need to. And there also is space in your dissertation to really talk about that, to really talk about your challenges with that and how you've come to a researcher and to situate yourself in this research and just simply call it out. Absolutely. As long as you do that, right, and then you're staying in those high ethical standards, then it actually helps others who read your study really think about how they might be able to think about themselves as an other. Because even when we're dealing with self, we're still an other. Mm-hmm. In some way, or I'm sure that you probably figured that out as you went through this study where we actually thought we were in the in, but we found out we were in the out. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It sounds like I can add a few more paragraphs to my discussion, and I'm excited to do so. Yeah. Thank you, David.
Aiden, great job.
Thank you.
Very groundbreaking, both in regard to identity formation, reformation, but also in regard to looking at developmental processes tied to social. So my question is, in your data, were you able to see any developmental cycles of when and how individuals self-reported who they are and where they're going?
Yeah, actually, that's funny you ask. Some of these posts stood out to me so much in terms of speaking so true to what I'm trying to say, in terms of that. And I think one of the things that I didn't do a good enough job was cataloging those spots where I saw that, because when you have 500 posts, to try to go back through and remember where that one thing was is really tough. But some of these posts stood out to me so much because they really were expressing themselves and using language that was new and refreshing and was about this ambiguity of expression in terms of exploration. And so some of these posts were said flat out, like, gender is an explorative process. Gender is ambiguous. Anyone that tries to control me in any way, X, Y, Z, and people talking about these horror stories of them having to, X, Y, Z. So it totally is like that. Like, I wish that I had spent more time cataloging which ones I saw stood out, but a lot of that was happening. Absolutely, yeah.
There'll be time for that.
Yes, I was like, I can go back to it. Yes. Oh yeah, there's
Here's the
online
question.
too, yeah.
Yep. Okay, so Karen asks, do you think that the idea of influencer hashtag plays a role? I know sometimes people put hashtags as an attempt to get followers or some other secondary gain. Is it possible that some of your subjects may have been impacted by that in their decision to use certain hashtags?
Oh my gosh. So Karen, you must have read what Brad wrote to me in my comments on my paper, because he literally asked me the exact same thing. What about this effect of like trending hashtags and stuff like that? It's definitely something that I didn't consider when I went in thinking about hashtags. But because of the National Coming Out Day, that was like, oh man, I got to clue in to the ways in which people use hashtags, but there's no research really at all to tell me how people perceive and use hashtags in daily life. But I think it absolutely makes an effect in terms of why people may have chosen to add so many hashtags as they did, or to identify in multiple ways. And so that was one comment that Brad made, was like, hey, this could be affected, and that's a limitation that I wrote about my study, was that potentially people added more to appear more because of the nature of public posts and the nature of the platform itself. So absolutely something I didn't consider, but have to write about now.
Okay, and there's one more from Anna, who says, hello, Regina. Says, I hear Regina part. Aiden, have you read any research or thought about conducting research in the VR space for gender exploration? Can elaborate if you can.
Yes.
The community doesn't get that at all.
So I've actually, we go to this conference, Digital Hollywood, and they do a lot of AR, VR talks and discussions. And I've gone up to 3 different people in VR, like big people in VR, and said, can we do this for people like working on dysphoria, people that want to, like, for specifically exactly the way that they're treating people with PTSD, similar things. How can we do that? But when I thought about it more in terms of ethics and putting a trans person through that experience, I don't believe truly that it's complicated, and I don't know enough, but I hope. I think I would benefit from it, so I hope that it happens, yeah.
So Aiden, they are already doing it for a whole variety of things that I don't think they've done for exactly what you're talking
Exactly,
about.
yeah. So they have done.
I just want to be really clear about that. So for issues with body weight, et cetera, they already have been doing that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but one of the things, I've read a couple cool studies about VR specifically in terms of body image, and identity too. They were testing women and men, and they were putting women in VR in a male body and vice versa. And so they were pulling results from that, but it's not the same. Yeah.
Anna says Vanderbilt University is, and you guys should talk.
Okay. See, this is connections. This is media psychology. Okay. Did I feel that? Oh, yes.
Aiden, I just wanted to say thank you for adding some voice for our community. We appreciate it. One of the things, I had a question about location. And since you gathered this information on National Coming Out Day, location was a question of whether it's urban or rural.
Yeah.
And if that would affect what they were putting out for that day.
Interesting. I think that's a good question too, because when you look at some of the research on uses and gratification, specifically for the trans community, One thing I do remember is that in rural settings, people were using Instagram or social media in different ways because they were so restricted in their personal lives. And so absolutely there is something happening there, but I just don't know. Unfortunately, yeah, there's not the research specifically for this isn't there to tell me much about it, but I absolutely think something exists. Yeah. Did I do a good job, everyone? Done?
You are going to get a new identity as Dr. Aiden Hirshfield.
Yes, thank you. Again. Yes.
That doesn't officially happen until you have submitted your
Yeah.
certificate. Will you do that? Because that
Yes.
is the next step to actually
Absolutely.
receiving the title, being official, and submitting to programs. So gotta put my
I'm excited.
medical
Ready to
hat on.
publish.
So I took my graduate program advisor hat on for a cool second.
Yeah, absolutely.
Aiden, we have
Thank
to
you.
get back to our faculty.
Yes, thank you all so much.
I'm sorry, Dr. Aiden.
Well, thanks, guys. Stick around.